I built $1 million empire while my family thought I was a failure. The first time I sat in that cold, sterile office building, my heart pounding like a war drum, I knew deep down that this was the moment everything would change. Or at least, I hoped it would. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me as if mocking my audacity to even be there. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched the folder containing months of sleepless nights and relentless determination. This wasn't just another presentation, it was my lifeline, my chance to prove to myself, and maybe someday to them, that I wasn't wasting my life. But they didn't see it that way. No one did. To my family, I was still the girl who had dropped out of her safe accounting program to chase some pipe dream about entrepreneurship. They couldn't understand why I'd traded stability for uncertainty, why I spent hours hunched over spreadsheets instead of applying for jobs that came with benefits and retirement plans. "You're throwing your life away," my father had said more times than I could count, his voice heavy with disappointment. And my mother? She tried to mask her concern with passive-aggressive comments about how nice it must feel to have so much free time while everyone else worked hard. Even my siblings joined in, rolling their eyes whenever I mentioned my latest project or milestone. It hurt. God, it hurt. But what stung most wasn't their words, it was the look in their eyes when they spoke to me. That flicker of pity mixed with disbelief, as though they were watching me spiral toward inevitable failure. It made me question myself every single day. Was I crazy? Delusional? Had I misjudged my abilities entirely? And yet, here I was, sitting across from 3 investors whose names carried weight in circles I once only dreamed of entering. Their faces were unreadable as I began my pitch, each word flowing out of me like water breaking through a dam. I told them about the problem I saw, a gap in an industry no one else seemed willing to address, and how I had found a solution. I showed them numbers, graphs, projections, all meticulously crafted by someone who refused to give up. I shared stories of early customers, people whose lives had already been touched by what I was building. Tears welled up in my eyes as I spoke, not because I was nervous but because I believed so deeply in what I was doing. Every late night, every sacrifice, every ounce of energy poured into this venture felt worth it in that moment. When I finished, silence hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a split second, I thought I'd blown it. Then, one of the investors leaned forward, his expression softening. "You know," he said slowly, "this is exactly the kind of passion we're looking for." That meeting changed everything, but not all at once. Success didn't come overnight, despite what those polished Instagram posts might suggest later on. What followed was a grueling journey filled with setbacks, rejections, and moments where giving up felt easier than continuing. There were days when I questioned whether I'd ever break through, when the weight of my family's disapproval pressed down on me like a lead blanket. But somewhere inside, buried beneath the doubt and fear, burned a fire that refused to go out. The seed of my empire started long before that pivotal meeting, back when I was just a kid scribbling ideas in the margins of school notebooks. I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor of my childhood bedroom, surrounded by scraps of paper covered in doodles and half-formed business plans. At 10 years old, I didn't know what entrepreneurship meant, but I understood instinctively that creating something from nothing thrilled me. Whether it was selling handmade bracelets to classmates or organizing neighborhood bake sales, I always found joy in turning an idea into reality. My parents, however, never shared my enthusiasm. To them, success meant following a clear, predictable path: get good grades, go to college, land a secure job, retire comfortably. Anything outside of that formula was reckless. So when I announced during high school that I wanted to start my own company someday, they dismissed it as childish fantasy. "You need a backup plan," my dad warned sternly. "Not everyone gets to live their dreams." Their skepticism planted seeds of doubt in my mind, but it also fueled my determination. If anything, their lack of faith pushed me to work harder, to prove them wrong, not just for myself but for anyone who dared to defy conventional expectations. College should have been my chance to shine, to show them I could balance academics with ambition. Instead, it became a battleground between their vision for my future and mine. By sophomore year, I was miserable. Accounting classes left me drained, and the thought of spending decades trapped behind a desk made my chest tighten. I craved creativity, innovation, risk, the very things my family feared most. One night, after another heated argument with my dad about my grades and lack of focus, I decided enough was enough. The next morning, I walked into the registrar's office and withdrew from the program. I'll never forget the look on my mom's face when I broke the news. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, unable to form coherent words. My dad exploded, yelling about wasted tuition money and shattered opportunities. My siblings whispered behind my back, calling me irresponsible and selfish. For weeks, tension crackled in our home like static electricity. Meals were eaten in silence, conversations reduced to terse exchanges. I felt like a ghost haunting my own house, invisible yet impossible to ignore. Determined to prove them wrong, I threw myself into building my first real business. It started small, a platform connecting local artisans with customers online, but quickly grew into something bigger than I'd imagined. Late nights blurred into early mornings as I juggled coding tutorials, marketing strategies, and customer service emails. Money was tight, forcing me to live off instant noodles and second-hand clothes. Friends drifted away, unable to relate to my obsessive drive. Loneliness became my constant companion, whispering doubts in my ear when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. Still, I pressed on. Each sale, each positive review, each new partnership felt like validation, a tiny crack in the wall of criticism surrounding me. Yet no matter how much progress I made, my family remained unconvinced. When I invited them to visit my makeshift office, a cramped studio apartment cluttered with whiteboards and sticky notes, they barely glanced around before launching into lectures about finding a real job. Even when I secured my first major client, earning enough to cover rent and then some, their praise was lukewarm at best. "It's nice you're making money," my mom said stiffly, "but it's not sustainable." Their words cut deeper than any rejection email or failed campaign ever could. Because as much as I wanted to believe in myself, part of me wondered if they were right. Maybe I was chasing something unattainable. Maybe I'd hit my peak too soon and was destined to crash spectacularly. Those thoughts haunted me, lurking in the shadows of my mind like specters waiting to strike. Despite the inner turmoil, I kept pushing forward. Building a business taught me resilience in ways I never anticipated. Rejection became a daily occurrence, but instead of crumbling under it, I learned to embrace it. Every no brought me closer to a yes. Every failure revealed a lesson I couldn't afford to ignore. Slowly but surely, pieces of my empire began falling into place. One of the biggest breakthroughs came unexpectedly, thanks to a networking event I almost skipped. Exhaustion had become my default state, and the thought of mingling with strangers held little appeal. But something, call it intuition or desperation, urged me to go anyway. That decision led me to meet Sarah, a seasoned entrepreneur who saw potential in my vision when few others did. Over coffee, she listened intently as I explained my goals and challenges. By the end of our conversation, she offered not only mentorship but also connections to key players in the industry. With Sarah's guidance, I refined my approach, honing both my product and my pitch. Doors that once seemed impenetrable began opening, revealing opportunities one hadn't dared to dream of. Investors took notice. Media outlets reached out for interviews. Customers flocked to my platform, drawn by its unique value proposition. Momentum built rapidly, propelling me further than I thought possible. Yet even amid triumph, loneliness lingered. As my business gained traction, relationships outside of work dwindled. Old friends stopped calling, unsure how to relate to the person I'd become. Romantic prospects faded, deterred by my relentless schedule and singular focus. Nights stretched long and quiet, punctuated only by the hum of my laptop and the occasional ring of my phone. Sometimes, I envied those living simpler lives, untouched by the pressures of leadership and growth. Other times, I reminded myself why I chose this path, to create something meaningful, something lasting. Ironically, the more successful I became, the more distant my family grew. They watched from afar, their expressions a mix of confusion and disdain. How could someone they deemed incapable achieve such heights? Rather than celebrate my victories, they doubled down on their criticisms, accusing me of prioritizing work over family. Holidays turned awkward, conversations strained. The love I craved felt just out of reach, obscured by layers of misunderstanding and pride. Still, I refused to let bitterness consume me. Deep down, I knew their reactions stemmed from fear, not of my success, but of change itself. Change frightened them because it challenged everything they believed about security and happiness. In their eyes, I represented unpredictability, a force threatening to disrupt the fragile order they clung to. So I continued forging ahead, channeling my pain into purpose. Every obstacle became fuel for growth, every setback a stepping stone toward greatness. The empire I envisioned grew larger, more intricate, more impactful. People depended on me now, not just employees and investors, but customers whose lives improved because of what I created. Knowing I made a difference kept me grounded, reminding me why I started this journey in the first place. But as the months passed, cracks began forming beneath the surface. Pressure mounted, expectations soared, and the line between personal and professional blurred dangerously. Doubts resurfaced, louder and more insistent than before. Could I sustain this pace indefinitely? Would my sacrifices ultimately pay off, or leave me empty-handed? Most importantly, would I ever earn the acceptance I so desperately sought? These questions swirled in my mind as I prepared for the next phase of expansion, a move that promised unprecedented growth but required immense courage. Investors awaited updates, employees relied on my leadership, and customers anticipated improvements. Meanwhile, my family stood on the sidelines, shaking their heads in disapproval. As I stared at the horizon, uncertain of what lay beyond, one thing remained clear: the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But quitting wasn't an option, not anymore. The weight of expectation pressed down on me like a storm cloud, but I refused to let it break me. The next phase of expansion was daunting, scaling operations, hiring new talent, and entering international markets, but I approached it with the same ferocity that had carried me this far. Yet, as much as I tried to focus on logistics and strategy, my mind kept drifting back to the people who mattered most, my family. Their absence in my journey gnawed at me, a quiet ache that never fully went away. It wasn't just their disapproval that hurt, it was the feeling of being unseen. They couldn't, or wouldn't, look past their own fears to see the person I'd become. To them, I was still the reckless girl who threw away stability for a dream. But they didn't know about the late nights spent researching market trends or the mornings I woke up before dawn to answer emails from clients halfway across the world. They didn't know how many times I cried alone in my car after a failed pitch or how hard I worked to keep my team motivated when things got tough. All they saw was what they wanted to believe, failure dressed up as ambition. And yet, I couldn't blame them entirely. Growing up, my parents had taught me the value of hard work, responsibility, and security. Their vision of success was rooted in survival, a legacy born out of sacrifices made by generations before them. My grandmother had fled war-torn lands with nothing but the clothes on her back. My grandfather had worked 3 jobs to put food on the table. In their eyes, taking risks was synonymous with gambling away everything they'd fought so hard to build. For them, entrepreneurship wasn't a path to prosperity, it was a leap into chaos. Understanding their perspective didn't make it easier to bear though. If anything, it complicated my emotions even more. Part of me longed to bridge the gap between us, to show them that my choices weren't reckless but calculated, driven by passion rather than impulsivity. Another part of me resented their inability to meet me halfway, to celebrate the victories I'd fought so hard to achieve. That tension simmered beneath the surface, bubbling over whenever we were together. One particularly painful encounter happened during Thanksgiving dinner. I had hoped, naively, that maybe this year would be different. After all, I'd reached milestones most people only dreamed of: partnerships with major brands, features in prestigious publications, revenue numbers that spoke for themselves. Surely, this would be the moment they finally acknowledged my accomplishments. Instead, the evening unfolded like a scene from a tragedy. As we sat around the dining table, plates piled high with turkey and stuffing, the conversation inevitably turned to careers. My brother boasted about his recent promotion at the bank where he worked, while my sister shared stories from her thriving medical practice. Both received glowing praise from our parents, who nodded approvingly as if checking off boxes on some invisible list of achievements. When it came time for me to speak, the room fell silent. "So, how's your little project going?" my dad asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's not a little project," I replied, forcing a smile despite the sting of his words. "We're expanding internationally now, actually. Things are going really well." "Oh," he said flatly, exchanging a glance with my mom. "That's nice." The word hung in the air like a dagger, piercing whatever hope I'd clung to. My siblings chimed in with thinly veiled jabs about how unstable startups could be, citing examples of businesses that had collapsed overnight. Even my younger cousin, barely out of college, offered unsolicited advice about the importance of job security. By the time dessert rolled around, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut repeatedly. I excused myself early, retreating to the solitude of my childhood bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at the walls covered in faded posters and old photographs. Memories flooded back, carefree summers spent playing outside, holiday traditions filled with laughter and love. This house had once been my sanctuary, a place where I felt safe and accepted. Now it felt alien, like a museum frozen in time while I moved forward without them. That night, I called Sarah. She'd become more than just a mentor. She was a lifeline, someone who understood the unique struggles of building something from scratch. When I told her about dinner, she listened patiently, letting me vent until the anger subsided and the tears took its place. "You can't pour from an empty cup," she said gently when I finally ran out of words. "You've given everything to this business, to proving yourself, not just to them, but to the world. But you're human too. Don't forget to take care of yourself along the way." Her advice stayed with me long after we hung up. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit how exhausted I truly was. Running $1 million empire wasn't glamorous. It was grueling, relentless, and often thankless. And yet, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every ounce of energy poured into this venture felt worth it because it represented freedom. Freedom to create, to innovate, to live life on my own terms. But freedom came at a cost. As the weeks turned into months, cracks began to form, not just in my personal life, but within the company itself. Rapid growth brought growing pains, and managing a larger team proved more difficult than I anticipated. Miscommunications led to missed deadlines, and internal conflicts threatened morale. Investors grew impatient, demanding faster results. Customers voiced concerns about quality slipping as we scaled operations. Suddenly, the foundation I'd worked so hard to build felt shaky, like sand crumbling beneath my feet. Panic set in. Sleep became elusive, replaced by endless scrolling through spreadsheets and emails. I micromanaged every decision, convinced that delegating responsibility would lead to disaster. Paranoia crept in, whispering doubts about whether I was truly capable of leading such a massive operation. Had I bitten off more than I could chew? Was this the beginning of the end? In moments of weakness, I considered reaching out to my family, not for help, but for reassurance. Maybe if I explained the gravity of the situation, they'd understand why I'd chosen this path. Maybe they'd offer support instead of judgment. But pride held me back. How could I expect them to believe in me when I barely believed in myself anymore? Then one day, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, an actual handwritten letter, not an email or text message. Curious, I opened it, recognizing my grandmother's looping cursive immediately. Inside she wrote, "My dear granddaughter, I hear whispers of your success, though few speak of it openly. I see the light in your eyes when you talk about your work, the fire that burns brighter than any fear. Do not let others dim that flame. You remind me of myself at your age, determined, fearless, unwilling to settle for less than extraordinary. Life is short, my child. Build your empire, chase your dreams, and never apologize for wanting more. With love, Grandma." Tears streamed down my face as I read her words over and over again. For years, I'd assumed she sided with my parents, dismissing my ambitions as foolishness. But here she was, affirming everything I'd ever hoped to hear. Her belief in me reignited something inside, a spark I thought had burned out under the weight of criticism and self-doubt. Armed with renewed determination, I returned to the office ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Micromanaging gave way to trust, paranoia transformed into confidence, and panic evolved into purpose. Slowly but surely, the cracks began to mend. Team members stepped up, taking ownership of projects and exceeding expectations. Investors expressed renewed faith, impressed by our ability to adapt and grow. Customers praised improvements, reaffirming their loyalty to the brand. Through it all, I remembered my grandmother's letter. Whenever doubt crept in, I pictured her sitting at her kitchen table, penning those words with trembling hands. She had lived through unimaginable hardship, yet she chose courage over fear, resilience over despair. Her legacy wasn't just one of survival, it was one of triumph against all odds. As the months passed, the empire continued to flourish. New markets opened doors previously locked tight, partnerships blossomed, and revenue soared. Media outlets dubbed me a visionary, colleagues hailed me as a leader, and customers celebrated me as a changemaker. Yet none of it compared to the quiet joy of knowing I'd built something meaningful, something that made a difference. Still, there remained one piece missing: reconciliation with my family. Despite their skepticism, I loved them fiercely, and their rejection left a void no amount of success could fill. So I decided to try one last time, not to convince them, but to connect. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I invited them to visit my headquarters, hoping to show them the reality behind the headlines. Standing in the lobby, surrounded by employees buzzing with energy, I watched as they walked in. Their expressions mirrored the mix of curiosity and apprehension I'd come to expect. For a moment, I wondered if inviting them had been a mistake. Then my father spoke, breaking the silence. "This place," he trailed off, looking around in awe. "This is yours." "Yes," I replied softly, bracing myself for his response. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there taking it all in. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "I underestimated you." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The room seemed to hold its breath as my father's words hung in the air. His apology, though simple, carried the weight of years of doubt, misunderstanding, and unspoken pain. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at him, searching his face for any sign that this wasn't just another fleeting acknowledgement but something deeper, more genuine. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he continued, his voice trembling now. "I thought I was protecting you, guiding you towards something safer." But seeing all this, he gestured around the bustling office, where employees worked with purpose, laughter mingling with the hum of productivity. "Seeing what you've built. I realize now how wrong I was." Tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. I wanted to respond, to tell him it was okay, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. Instead, I stepped forward and hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his arms envelop me after so many cold, distant years. It wasn't perfect, it couldn't erase everything, but it was enough. Enough to begin healing, enough to rebuild what had been broken. My mother approached next, her expression softer than I'd ever seen it. She reached out tentatively, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We're proud of you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "We always have been, even if we didn't know how to show it." Behind them, my siblings stood awkwardly, unsure of what to say. But their silence spoke volumes. They were here, they had come, and that alone meant more than words ever could. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had shaped me yet often doubted me, I felt a profound sense of closure. The wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but they no longer felt insurmountable. After the visit, things began to shift, not immediately, not perfectly, but steadily. Conversations that once centered on criticism or concern slowly evolved into curiosity and pride. My dad started asking questions about the business, genuinely interested in understanding what I did. My mom called more often, not to lecture but to check in, her tone warmer and more supportive. Even my siblings found ways to connect, sharing stories of their own challenges and triumphs. But perhaps the most surprising change came from within myself. Their acceptance freed something inside me, a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for so long. Without the constant need to prove myself to them, I could focus entirely on leading with authenticity and purpose. The pressure to be flawless gave way to embracing imperfection, to learning and growing alongside my team rather than pretending to have all the answers. As the empire continued to expand, I made a conscious effort to prioritize balance. Late nights became less frequent, replaced by evenings spent reconnecting with old friends or simply enjoying quiet moments alone. I hired a leadership coach to help me delegate effectively, trusting others to share the load instead of shouldering it all myself. And I dedicated time each week to mentor aspiring entrepreneurs, paying forward the guidance and support I'd received along the way. One evening, as I sat on the rooftop terrace of my new apartment overlooking the city skyline, I reflected on how far I'd come. The journey hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been messy, painful, and exhausting at times, but every step had been worth it. From the lonely days of uncertainty to the triumphant highs of success, each experience had shaped me into the person I was today, resilient, compassionate, and unapologetically driven. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Opening the door, I found my grandmother standing there, smiling warmly. She handed me a small box wrapped in delicate paper. "For you," she said simply. Inside was an antique locket engraved with the words "courage over fear." Inside the locket was a tiny photograph of us together when I was a child, her arm wrapped protectively around me. Tears sprang to my eyes as I clasped it around my neck, feeling the weight of her love and wisdom settle over me like a shield. "Thank you," I whispered, pulling her into a tight embrace. "For everything." She patted my back gently, her voice steady and sure. "You've always had the strength within you, my dear. I'm just glad you finally see it too." Months later, I stood on stage at a prestigious entrepreneurship summit, delivering a keynote speech to a crowd of thousands. As I gazed out at the sea of faces, I thought about the winding road that had brought me here, the failures, the sacrifices, the relationships tested and repaired. I thought about my family, sitting in the front row, cheering me on with smiles that spoke of forgiveness and pride. And I thought about myself, the girl who once dreamed of building something extraordinary, who refused to let anyone else define her worth. "My story isn't unique," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "It's one of struggle, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of a dream. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: success isn't measured by accolades or bank accounts. It's measured by the lives you touch, the barriers you break, and the courage you find when the world tells you to give up." The audience erupted into applause, but my gaze lingered on my family. They weren't just spectators anymore, they were part of my story, woven into the fabric of my journey. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I wouldn't face them alone. When the event ended, I walked off stage to find my dad waiting for me, holding out a bouquet of flowers. "For the visionary," he said with a grin, his eyes shining with pride. I laughed through tears, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," I murmured, "for believing in me, even when it took you a little longer." He chuckled softly, squeezing my hand. "Better late than never, right?" As we walked out together, surrounded by loved ones and colleagues, I realized something profound. The empire I had built wasn't just a business, it was a testament to perseverance, to the power of believing in oneself against all odds. And while the journey wasn't over, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. In that moment, I felt whole.